Hey everybody, it's Steve, Tantric Decks from Black Octopus Sound, and this is a tutorial video where I will be mastering a drum and bass tune from one of my students. He's a blossoming drum and bass producer named Zeal. I highly recommend checking him out. As you'll hear, he's got a very high energy but beautiful melody-driven style of drum and bass that is absolutely spectacular, and I'm stoked to have been a part of this guy's story as his teacher and mentor, and now he's blossoming into an amazing and brilliant producer, and it's really fun to watch. And this is a pre-master of one of his tracks that he's finished, and I'm going to be mastering it up so that you can get a glimpse of how I do my mastering process. So here it is. So I have a pretty extensive mastering chain, and that's kind of where the magic starts. And one thing you'll find is that I don't actually use absolutely every single plugin in this chain. I just have a buffet of different options that I'd like to use, and some of them which I'll be leaving out, as you'll see. So the first thing that I do when I'm mastering a track is, number one, first and foremost, is I get into the right headspace. And I think this is just one of the most understated and highly important things about mastering is about going in with the right frame of mind in the first place. If you're not really into it and you're kind of feeling exhausted or tired and just like not enthusiastic about the project, then that sort of energy is going to cascade into the work that you're doing. So as a rule, I never, ever, ever master A, my own music, or B, especially somebody else's music who's trusting me to work some magic on their track. I would never put that type of energy into music at all. So I wait till I'm stoked about it and enthusiastic about the project, and then I go into it. So that being said, mastering is about half state of mind and half technical skill and ear training. So the state of mind piece right now is dialed down, and so the next important piece is the technical ear training component. So let's get into that. So I've listened to the full track from front to back, and I've noticed a few things. It's a fairly well-rounded mix, as you'll see, and there's just a couple shifts and adjustments that I'm going to consider making while I'm here. And so let's just get started. The first part of my mastering chain has a low-end saturator, and since this is drum and bass music, I'm probably going to consider using it, but that also depends on the mix. Mastering is both an art and it's engineering. So the art portion of it, in art, no art ever turns out exactly the same way twice. And that's just the nature of art. It's a realm of infinity, of infinite potential. And engineering is sort of the opposite. Engineering is about getting the exact same results every single time. So you'll understand what I mean if you don't already by mastering is half an art and half engineering. So we want to get a nice commercially rounded track, which is the engineering component, but we also can add our own artistic flavor to our mastering as well. And there's a few different ways that I do both of those things. So here's a track. And something else that I do while I'm mastering is I listen to the track at different volumes just to kind of get a reference point from a few different lenses, through a few different lenses. So I'll listen, I would say about 70% of the time at approximate comfortable listening volume, maybe just slightly quieter than comfortable listening volume, like at the level that people would have, a medium strength of conversation, not like an argument or yelling, or not like a whispering conversation, but like a medium level conversation. And then I'll crank it up, and then I will keep it really quiet for a little bit as well. So I'll get the full range of perception. So another important piece of the mastering process, and this is going back to the state of mind and closely relates to ear training, is we want to be hyper nitpicky. People who explore mastering, particularly engineers as a career, get so over the top nitpicky about all music. So warning, if you're going down this path and you're new to it, it's going to ruin listening to music forever for you, because you will just hyper nitpick absolutely everything in every track you ever hear. So just being warned, you're kind of changing your neurology about how you think about music when you're doing this. And so about that, while I'm listening, I'm being hypercritical, and I'll just bring up an EQ just so we have a quick visual here. I'm being hypercritical to absolutely every area of the frequency spectrum. I'm listening closely, similar to how you would see, look at your desk or wherever you're sitting right now and look at like a speck of dust or just like a cookie crumb or whatever, just like a little speck of something. And look at it, look directly at it. Your eyes are focusing on a specific area of your desk. They're hyper concentrated. Your awareness is hyper concentrated on one particular thing. And that's what's happening when I'm focusing my ears. Instead, it's the ears organ instead of the eyes. You want to focus with your ears, hyper focus your ears into different parts of the frequency spectrum. We're talking about the sub bass, the all important lower mid range, which gives us that sense of power and fullness in music, the central mid range, which is what gives us perceived loudness and things like that, which enhances that, and clarity and also power, the upper mids, which gives us definition and bite, and the treble, which gives us that nice top end, high-end airiness. We want to hyper concentrate or focus into absolutely every area of the spectrum. And the idea is in the mastering engineer's chair, you want to be able to hear music and say, that bass line has a little bit too much going on at 140 hertz, so I'm going to do a 1 decibel EQ cut there to help round it out. You want to develop the skills so you get hyper precision hearing. And if you're not there yet, that's okay. It takes practice. I've been doing this for 12 years, and I'm still learning and growing all the time. And so it's a lifelong journey. So just that needs to be said. Okay, so I might just add a little pinch of low-end saturation, and I'm going to keep that on the back burner, and I'm going to consider that later on, particularly when we get to the compression stage and the limiting stage. I'm going to remember that I've done this, and I may go back and make some adjustments later down the road, but I want to just give it just a little bit of a nudge. And my choice is the Max Bass plugin in the Waves bundle. It's absolutely great. I highly recommend it. It's really nice for getting that sense of like filling out the low end and adding a bit of low end power to either masters, or you can put this on an audio or MIDI track in your composition and just add a little bit of extra low end fullness. And so as you'll see, I've given it a little bit of a nudge here, and you can adjust the frequency response as well. I found that around 70 to 80 is the sweet spot where it kind of gives me right in that central. That's the saturation happens in the lower mid-range there, kind of in that central area where we add power to a mix, which is the idea of me doing this. Okay, another thing that I need to say is that all mastering engineers are like fingerprints. We're all different. And so every single mastering tech on the planet has a different approach. And that's just the nature of the beast. So no two mastering engineers will ever be the same. And so if you find that my methods are just like a little bit crazy and weird looking, they probably are. And because they're unique to me, I guarantee you I'm the only person who does mastering on the planet like this. There may be people who closer have some versions of it, but nobody masters exactly the same, period. So if you think this is weird, it's because it is. So you're right about that. And it's okay to be weird as long as it works. So the next step is I have my Izotope Ozone 6 Advanced EQ, and I have it in mid-side mode. And this is a staple mastering technique that I do on absolutely every track that I ever master. And so it's a very simple one-step process. This is all I use this for, is just for the simple mid-side function. you activate mid side. The default is stereo. You just activate the M plus S, mid plus side. And so mid means mono information, and side means stereo information. So we're literally able to adjust the mono, simply the mono audio, and simply the stereo audio isolated from each other. So there's nothing going on to the mids at the moment. And I've done on the stereo, I've done an EQ cut at approximately 100 hertz. Now, this cutoff point is different for every master depending on the mix down, the style of music. The more that I take away, the more I'm taking away stereo audio energy in the low end. And that's the point, is we want to take away mostly just the sub bass arena so that it's strictly in mono. And this is just a mastering best practice because we're cleaning up information that's unnecessary in the low end. And so that's nice. So what that does is it also gives us more headroom and allows us to get slightly louder masters, which is nice. But the magic happens in the fact that because we're taking away the stereo information in the low end and isolating just the mono, only the mono remains. The mono information has so much more room to breathe and stretch its legs and do its thing and be heard with clarity. So that's a really nice bonus of this technique, and I highly recommend doing some version of this with a mid-side EQ in mastering. And so listening to the track, I'm just going to check the roll-off. Remember how I mentioned that the sense of power comes from 100 to 200-ish, maybe 300? Then that means I want to be careful with how high I'm cutting this off, and I'm paying exquisite attention to if it's gaining power or losing power, or gaining clarity in the low end while losing power. I want to find that sweet spot where I'm gaining clarity but not sacrificing my lower mid-range power. So I'm not sure if you heard the subtle difference, and that's the thing, is all of these are subtle steps. Each step of the way is just a micro tweak, and several micro tweaks makes one big whole brand new picture at the end. So just keep in mind that this is meant to be subtle, and you may, depending on your monitoring setup and how you're viewing this video, you may or may not have even noticed a difference, and that's all part of the ear training. So I definitely noticed a difference in the low end sense of power, the way that the music hits me right in the chest, the higher that I went up the spectrum. So I decided that at approximately 120 is the sweet spot for me for this, and I'm going to choose to keep it there. So my next step is I have 2 EQs, and these are my favorite EQs. Basically, essentially my favorite plugins ever. It's the Melda series, like Zelda, the video game character, but with an M in the front instead of a Z. Melda. And their plugins are just freaking fantastic. I can't even go on enough. I'm kind of like a Melda evangelist, to be honest. They're just so good and so next level. They've been next level for 5 or 6, 7, 8, 9 years now running. And they're just absolutely awesome. So yeah. So I use a linear phase EQ, and this is important because when we do an EQ boost, we're doing it to both the left and right channel at the same time. And a normal EQ, what happens is as we do this boost, this is just a nature of the beast with normal EQs, is that the left and right can go off phase a little bit. And normally that's not a big deal if we're EQing, say, a vocal or something like that. It's barely detectable. But because this is a whole stereo mix with drums, bass, mid-range, treble, then doing some sort of a boost or cut and offsetting the phase from the left and right channels can actually create a bit of a mess and a phase nightmare. So we want to use linear phase. So when we do these boosts, linear phase EQs are designed to not create that phase. They're actually engineered in a way that doesn't do that. So with all mastering, you want to use a linear phase EQ. Okay, so this is a single instance of an EQ, and this is all I use this for. These are 2 staple EQ settings that I have on all masters. Is I roll off the low end just a little bit depending on the track and the frequency response. It's got a built-in analyzer, which is nice. And so I'll check the frequency response. And so two things are happening. Number one, I'm watching with my eyes, but more importantly than that, I'm listening with my ears about how these are affecting the sound. And so I'm rolling off the low end just to kind of carve out any of that subsonic rumble. And because this is drum and bass music, I don't want to rob too much power from the sub, so I'm just going to actually creep my cut just a little bit over more. And this boost over here is about a 5 decibel boost, and I'm going to keep that around 16.5K. I found to be kind of the sweet spot for this. And what this does is it adds a little bit of air, and it's once again one of those subtle things, but it adds a really nice air to the top of the master. And I'm just going to turn this on and on. See, I've got my mastering chain in a rack, and what that allows me to do is just hit the power button, so I can always reference as I'm going what I'm doing to the track. So now is a good time to get a reference point. And so I'm going to check with the cuts on, with these adjustments on and off, and just see if I can hear the subtle difference and changes. So you may have noticed that with these plugins activated, there's just a little bit more enhanced clarity in the low end. And that's the gift of the mid-side EQ technique. So now I have another instance of an EQ, same EQ, and this is the one that I use to do my carving of the sound. So this is where I will make any boost I want to make. And if you're wondering what this function is while I'm clicking, it's upsampling, meaning the plugin uses more processing power, but it gives a higher quality. This is where I'll do all of my tonal adjustments. So I'm noticing that after listening to it that the high end is a bit bright. So just to at normal listening volumes that might be okay, but at loud volumes, particularly on a big sound system, remember that's kind of the vision you want to tailor your masters to, is like to sound good on all systems, but particularly big sound systems. Big sonic disasters are made brutally obvious on big sound systems, so we want to be taking care of those and closing those doors in the mastering stage. So I'm hearing it around maybe 4 or 5 kilohertz, but it could be a little bit higher. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to do two things. I'm going to make a big boost and just kind of scope the spectrum just to hear what's happening up there, and just to hyper locate what frequency it is that I'm hearing. So it's 5.6K approximately. So I'm going to do just a little bit of a cut there. And now let's see how that influences the music. So I'm noticing this cut made it sound just a little bit dull. So I'm going to zoom in and do less of a cut. Okay, so I'm going to be content with that for now, and I'm just going to move on. I might come back to this EQ and make some more adjustments later. I'm not hearing anything that's pertinent and burning right now, so other than that, we're just going to move on. And so the next stage is going to be compression. And so my go-to compressor these days is the Poig Child 670 from the Waves bundle. And I love it because it's just a really, really musical compressor. I have a couple other options here. The glue that comes with Ableton, and I have the API 2500, which is also part of the Waves bundle. Another great one that's really got a nice warm character to it that is just got that something special that we want in a really nice fat compressor. And so these are all three of my personal favorite mastering compressors. And the Poik Child is my number one, and I use it most often, but occasionally we find, and this is the artistic piece of mastering, occasionally we find that one compressor might suit one track really well, but it might not suit another track. That's a different genre or a different style of different tonality or whatever. It's just a different track and might require a different compressor that suits it. That sounds more harmonious even. So I really enjoy this one, and you'll get a chance to scope it out if you haven't yet. It's very simple, and it's got an option of having different left and right settings, which I don't. I have them linked, so I'm just working with this top row because they're all linked. So you'll see I'm working the on and off switch, and what I'm doing is I'm getting the output gain to match exactly the level of the volume with it turned off. I want those volumes to be equal. And the reason why I do that is because that helps me get a fair comparison of what the compressor is actually doing. If it's louder, then I might, just because of the psychological nature of sound, I might perceive it to be fatter, but really it's just louder, and it's not. That doesn't make it better. So what I'm doing is I'm wanting this compressor to make the master better. And so I want to get the volume levels exactly equal with the plugin off and on, and then that gives me a fair reference point to see what it's actually doing. Okay, so I'm shooting for about 3 decibels of gain reduction here. I usually don't compress masters more than 3 decibels, and I have compressed masters harder upon request. I have had clients who just want their music totally slammed and as loud as possible, and I can do that. It's not my preference, so that's driving my decision behind my compressor settings. You might notice that there's like the sense of pressure or movement, or like it's like character is another way of naming it, but it's difficult to tangibly name and speak and transform into language that's really easy to understand, because it's more of an experience and a feeling that this compressor offers that others can't. I can dial these exact same settings into these other compressors, and you'll notice that there's a distinct different character. It's subtle, but it's distinct. And I really like the sense of pressure and movement that this compressor offers. And you might be able to sense that. I'll just do this one more time so you can listen for that. I'm just head over heels in love with this compressor. It is just so yummy sounding. I just love it. It's so good. And from there, we'll move on. I'm happy with those settings. So I'm going to open up my mid-side setting, Ozone Dynamics. And sometimes I will use some subtle compression in each of the different frequency bands. But more so, as opposed to using EQ, what I tend to do to tonally around my masters that I work on is I use multiband compression. And you don't even actually have to do any gain reduction. It's just nice to have these rounded EQ bands, and you can just give them a nudge with your gain. So that's often what I'll do is, and I'm noticing that I want a little bit more power yet still in my low end. So I'm going to take my low band and in my mono section, my mid section, and I'm going to isolate from 0 to 200, and I'm just going to give it a little bit of a nudge in the gain, just so I'm adding a little bit of extra power to this whole area of the spectrum. So just like I suspected, I still want some more power, and I don't want to overdo it with the multiband compressor. So I'm actually going to go back to my EQ, and I'm going to add an EQ boost from the 100 to 200 hertz area, and I'm going to do that to add a little bit more sense of power and fullness to the lower mid range. We want to be careful when we're boosting in this area because it's also a huge culprit of low end muddiness, and so we want to be hyper cautious. I didn't hear any of that in this track at all, so I'm feeling I have the green light to do an EQ boost here. I don't always boost down here because of the risk of running some low end muddiness, and that's just not acceptable in mastering. So I feel okay about doing it in this particular mix because it's not muddy in the lower mid range. And so I feel like I can pull it off, but I just want to be hyper scrutinizing of doing a boost like this. That's the point. And something else that I like to do is I like to add just a little bit of a nudge to the upper mids and the highs in the multiband compressor, both in the mid and side setting. I like to give a little bit extra to the sides because that it creates a stereo widening effect. So what this does is I've boosted my low end, as you know, and I've also boosted my upper mids and highs, and that's gonna kind of create what's often referred to as a smile curve. And I'll just do a smile curve with this free form EQ that comes with Melda, where you get this sort of smile curve where you boost the lows and you boost the highs. It's called a smile curve, commonly referred to as, and so this kind of gives us this rounded boost, and that's nice for bringing out the bite in the highs and the fatness in the lows. So that's my settings with my multiband compressor, and I'm actually gonna listen to it a little bit more and see if I need to make any subtle shifts and adjustments. You might be able to hear that subtle extra sense of wideness that happens. You may have noticed I just turned the multiband compressor on and off just to hear the difference that it makes, and it really opened up the stereo field in a nice way. And so I'm really satisfied with how this sounds for now. And so next I occasionally use Ozone's exciter, but I'm not going to in this. It's just not necessary. The next two are Ozone's stereo imager, which I use sometimes, or Melda's stereo spread, which I love. And so I'm going to start with Melda's stereo spread first. And once again, sometimes it's more appropriate to use the Ozone stereo imager, and I'll make my decision as I test both of them out. And so with stereo widening, the thing that I love about the Melda stereo spread is that I have a minimum frequency option, meaning that I can stereo widen anywhere from 25 hertz and up, all the way up to just hyper fine tuning the stereo widening from 7 kilohertz and up. And I usually start at 7K. And the reason why I do that is just because if I'm stereo widening, I'll just show you the difference, what it sounds like. But it can actually create a muddy, unclear mess if we overdo it. So I like to keep it 7K and up just because it adds that extra airiness and character to a master. So let's check it out. Listen to the air difference. This is off, on. There you go. Can you sense that extra air? It might actually even be too much, so I'm going to turn it down. And now we really hear this master coming to life with the on and off. On. Off. Another plugin that I like is the Kramer Tape. It's a tape saturation emulator. And I could do a whole 20-minute tutorial on just this plugin. So it has a little bit of unconventional options like your speed and bias and flux, wow and flutter and things like that. So I'm not going to go too into it, but I have these settings. Basically, this is my own mastering preset that I use. And I'm going to listen for the extra little bit of character that it adds. Sometimes it can take away. And I'm going to test that with the speed and the bias knobs. And if it enhances the track and I like it, like the character that it adds, I'll use it. And if it doesn't, then I won't use it. So I'm noticing this master starting to get sound a little bit bright on the high end, and that's coming from either the stereo spread or the multiband compressor settings that we've used. So I'm going to just squeeze the top end a little bit with the multiband compressor. Just getting a little bit of gain reduction happening here. Actually, the Kramer Tape actually added that subtle little bit of unpleasantness to the high end, so I'm not going to use it. And the next stage is limiting. So for limiter, I use one of two. This is the Ozone 6 Maximizer, which I always keep on IRC3 and Crisp, just because those are my preferences. I find them to be the nicest and sexiest. I'll work the character, which is essentially an attack and release setting that is built into one fader, and a transient emphasis. The transient emphasis, what that does is it adds a transient boost, a transient shaper boost pre-mastering. So before it essentially, prior to this plugin, just boosts the transients a little bit, depending on how much of this fader I push it, and which can actually help us preserve a sense of dynamics and punch to our drums, which we know that with overcompressed drums they tend to lose. They tend to lose their mojo a little bit and can sound a little flat and muffled and stifled or pressed. And this helps us sort of counterbalance that. So I'm going to start pushing the threshold down, and I'm going to be listening to how the limiter's responding. Because this is drum and bass music, mastering drum and bass is really unique in terms of the type of limiter settings you want. just because there's so many drums and transients flying all over the place so quickly because of the tempo, that we just need to be mindful about how the attack and release is influencing the gain reduction of the limiter. And so something that we find is that mastering, particularly the limiting stage, makes any mixdown issues painfully obvious. And I'm still noticing that the high end's a little bit too bright for my taste. So I'm going to go back into my multiband compressor and make some adjustments so that I'm not creating an unpleasant ear fatiguing high end in this master. So what I've just done is I've done another EQ cut in the high end around 4.1K to further tone down that high end hiss and ear fatiguing fullness that the high end in this track has. And to sort of counterbalance that a little bit, I wanted to emphasize the mid-range a little bit. Instead of having a lot of emphasis going on up here, which the mix does, I wanted to kind of bring out the central mid-range a little bit more. I gave the boost around the area where the human voice peaks, where particularly the central range of the human voice, where it peaks the loudest. And the ear is biologically programmed to be a little bit more sensitive to that part of the frequency spectrum than anywhere else, because it makes sense, because that's how we communicate to each other. So it makes perfect sense that nature would program us to be more sensitive to the range of the human voice. Anyways, so I've given just a little bit of a nudge there, and as you might have saw me boost the spectrum, and I was, instead of more listening, I was more feeling how this boost made me feel. And there's some subtle emotional things that can show up in mastering as well, like subtle hints of like agitation or irritation and things like that. If something's like really grinding on you a little bit, that's a red flag that there's something could be off in the audio. And so I swept this boost from about 600 down to about 450 to find out figure out how it made me feel. And I found that the place that warmed my heart the most was the frequency 548. It just felt the nicest to me. And so that influenced my decision to put that there. Now we're gonna go back to the limiter and see if we can work the settings of the limiter now that I'm more comfortable with the tonal rounding. And I always am, every master, I'm finding myself having to make it go back into my chain and make adjustments once I reach the limiter stage, because now we're getting a real sense for how the master is gonna sound. And see, the harder I'm pushing it, we're getting some subtle hints of some overcompression distortion. I'm looking at two numbers. I'm looking at this one here, and I'm looking at this RMS average right here. Most commercial masters have this number around -3. Minus 2.5 to minus 3.5. And so that's kind of my target for mastering for clients, because usually they want their tracks mastered to be comparable to the best in the world that's out there. And so that's usually where I push them to. In my own masters and my own tracks, I tend to go a little bit lighter and just keep it a little bit quieter, so I have a little bit more dynamics and it's not so pressed. And but that's my preference. And so since this is for a client, I'm going to push it as hard as I can and get as loud as I can without sacrificing any sound quality. So something that I'm doing when I'm making these adjustments is I'm on a Mac, so I'm holding the command key, I'm clicking the parameters, so the character, and I'm holding the command key and using my up and down arrow to direct it up and down as opposed to using my mouse. And I was at 2.8, so I'm just gonna move that back. There we go. And so this is about as hard as I would be interested in pushing this limiter. So now I'm gonna go over and use Melda's dynamics and just give that a test to see how that works for me. I'm going to turn up the upsampling so it's nice and high quality. It has a built-in saturator, which I may or may not use. I'll keep the dry wet at 0 for now. And I usually turn the attack all the way up and keep the release really quiet. And I find that this setting particularly helps with preserving transients the best. So there's 100 milliseconds for those transients to poke through the mix, so before the gain reduction happens. If this is at 0, the master can sound super flat. So you want, but at the same time, you want to work the attack and release settings in a way that works with the overall groove of the track as well, which is another musical concept in mastering, which is more the artistic approach to it. And that sort of skill is just developed with time. So anyways, I'm going to scale the threshold back so that it's at least of equal volume to Ozone. So I'm appreciating the character of the Ozone limiter more than the Melda. The Melda is kind of flattening it, and I really like the extra character that the Ozone limiter offers. So I'm going to stick with Ozone. And now that I'm done my mastering process, I'm going to listen to the whole track front to back, and hear if there's any issues that's showing up, which can happen at the end of the road. So I'm just going to listen to it front to back, and then we'll see if we need to make any more adjustments. So when I reached this part of the track, I noticed that there was a little bit more. Maybe there's a new instrument layer added or something that was just creating this extra layer of high-end sizzle. And so as I was listening, I went in and added a new EQ notch cut. And that was that decision, as you saw me on the fly. As I even experimented with trying a De-Esser, which I do use in mastering sometimes. If there's like a metallic hiss or a weird high-end piece that needs to just come down a little bit, sometimes I'll use a De-Esser. De-Essers are just a little bit nicer. The reason why I would consider using a De-Esser is because instead of it being static like an EQ, meaning that this boost is there all the time throughout the whole track because it's a boost on a cut on an EQ. Whereas with a De-Esser, there's only gain reduction happening once that frequency crosses the threshold. So only times where it's too loud, the frequency has some gain reduction happening. That frequency gets compressed. So sometimes I use a De-Esser, but in this instance, I just realized that the EQ, because it's such a dominant quality in this mixdown, that I think the EQ might be a better option. So anyways, that's me mastering this track. I hope you were able to pick some golden nuggets out of this video, and I hope it serves you well. Anyways, take care, everybody. Ciao.